Listen as your day unfolds, challenge what the future holds. Try and keep your head up to the sky. Lovers, they may cause you tears. Go ahead, release your fears. Stand up and be counted, don't be ashamed to cry. You gotta be bad, you gotta be bold, you gotta be wiser. You gotta be hard, you gotta be tough, you gotta be stronger. You gotta be cool, you gotta be calm, you gotta stay together. All I know, love will save the day. Herald what your mother said, read the books your father read, trying to solve the puzzles in your own sweet time. Some may have more cash than you, let's take a
Hello. Thank you all for coming out today. At our events, NSSLHA invites joining late, fidgeting, stimming, walking around, lying down, eating, drinking, engaging with your camera on or off, and using any modality to communicate. Today, Jeff Conn will present on gender affirming voice and communication, followed by a Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to enter them in the chat or to use the raise hand function. And now, Jeff Conn.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I hope we're all doing well at the beginning of week 8. And yes, so I would love to share my sort of take on what services we provide for gender diverse folks. And I'm happy to kind of take this in almost any direction that you want to go, because it's too much for just one day to talk about, at least the way that I ramble anyway. And so I do have a set of slides and an accompanying video lecture that I use for a guest lecture in the voice disorders class at the graduate level. And so I thought I would start with those slides and kind of move from there and figure out kind of what you want to learn. So I know, long story short, I don't have like a set agenda. I want to kind of get a sense of what you all are interested in and how we can move through some of this information in a way that is most relevant for you. So first of all, let's, these particular slides there's a lot of them. And so I kind of have these 4 main areas that I can talk about. So I can expand on any of these, but one would be sort of thinking about the SLP's role and perspectives working with gender diverse communities. The second one could be learning more about the communities, learning more about gender diversity in general as it pertains to our potential clients and participants. The third could be talking about types of assessments that we use or that are used. And then the fourth one could be more specific about what the actual instruction or treatment or therapy looks like. So just kind of getting a sense of which of these is the most interesting for folks. I'd like you to put in the chat, what's one thing you wanted to learn more about coming to this talk? Do I need to say go, do it? Okay, so we're getting some things. Hormone therapy, not the depths of my knowledge, but I can talk a little bit about that. Number 4, instruction about the lab at PSU. Anything, everything, all the things. All right. Okay, so it sounds like it's a wide range of things. Let me think for a second. Where do I want to go? Bear with me one more second. So we have at Portland State, we have the Gender Communication Lab, which is one of our, uh, I think by the end of the term, I completely lose the ability to like look up websites and talk at the same time. So bear with me one more second. Okay, so we have the Gender Communication Lab at PSU, which is one of our Portland State run clinics available for grad student clinicians to gain their clinical clock hours. And I'm super excited that I've been able to offer this experience, not just for students, but for clients. I actually call them participants, and I can get a little bit into that perspective and why it's the Gender Communication Lab and not the Trans Voice Clinic as it sort of originally started, and as it is in many parts of the country at university clinics. And so I knew I wanted to work with this community, now my community, before it was my community. And I think that I found out that SLPs interacted with the gender diverse community, the LGBTQ plus community in general, in this way, working with, at the time, it was mostly with trans women who wanted to change their voice. I'll just say it in the ways that it was talked about at the time. And so I thought, yes, I want to do this work. How do I do this work? I spoke with our clinic director, Claudia Meyer, who was very supportive, and said, let's figure out how you can bring this to PSU. And so we talked with the folks at OHSU's Northwest Center for Voice and Swallowing, Donna Gravel, and in a very short conversation about how we wanted to do this, how I wanted to do this, but I needed more background in voice because I didn't have any, hadn't really done voice as a therapist, and there really isn't much voice happening in the curriculum at the undergrad or the grad level, to be frank. And so I didn't know how to break into that world. And so Donna Graville was kind enough and a little bit scary enough in that moment to say, why don't you come work with Karen Drake, who is one of OHSU's Northwest Center for Voice and Swallowing's long-standing voice therapist, and does a lot of voice, professional voice, medical voice, all sorts of voice things, and sort of do an internship as I was a professor and also would be an intern. So I got to go to OHSU for a term, was there maybe once, twice a week, a little bit for hours, and learned everything I could about voice very quickly. Did as much professional development as I could around voice, all of the ASHA conferences, OSHA conferences, any conferences that came up about voice. I just started learning more and more about voice. And it quickly became, within a year, the Gender Communication Lab. So it took, I still have a lot of insecurities around voice because it's not something that I've done outside of this experience. So all of the voice therapy hours that I've done have been within this lab as a supervisor, often providing the treatment or instruction to clients alongside my students. So I'm kind of learning with the students, and it's a little bit of a challenge at this moment, but it's been happening for 3 years now, so I should feel a little more secure, I suppose. But it's one of those things as a clinician, as any kind of clinician, there is that level of insecurity, especially when you're new to something, and that doesn't, the way that I get over that is I find that helping folks and really connecting people with their goals and figuring out what their goals are, I just sort of delve in there and forget my insecurities at the door and just do what I can do, knowing that I don't know everything. I know someone else might be able to do something more, but I can only do what I can do in that moment. And if I give myself all of that in that moment, then I'm doing the best I can. And so that's where my insecurities stay outside the clinic room. And then I pick them up again when I leave. So I just want to be very transparent. We don't always know exactly what we're doing, but we are finding ways to connect as much of the professional world to our clients as we can based on what we know. Sorry, now I'm getting a little lost. So the Gender Communication Lab came out of that. It came also out of my background, my PhD in linguistics. My dissertation was on kind of language and gender. I measured many vowels from Philadelphians and looked at sort of how gender, and at that moment it was whether you were I didn't look at sort of trans or non-binary folks. It was all cisgender folks, but I was looking at sexual orientation and gender and how that plays a role in our accents. And so I had this knowledge of language and gender from linguistics that I wanted to bring into and add to sort of voice. And so I wanted to create something a little bit different than what everyone else was creating, I guess, as I saw that most of it was centered around voice and resonance. And it, because of that, it kind of only focused on trans women. And I can explain a little bit why that is. But I decided I wasn't going to exclude anyone except for cisgender people. I have to find a different way to say that, but that's the truth of it. And I wanted to figure out, can we find gender communicative instruments and tools that someone could learn about to really work for any sort of gender moment for their lives. That's a pretty high goal, but it was something that I was pretty dedicated to, and it honestly, it doesn't always work. And then I realized as I meet more and more potential clients that the gender identity doesn't matter as much as which direction they want to go. And even if we take ourselves out of the binary gender, chances are a person is going to feel more comfortable in sort of masculine spaces or feminine spaces, depending on kind of how they were socialized and their sex assigned at birth, and are wanting to explore kind of the other side, often is the way that it's talked about. And I know it keeps reinforcing the gender binary, but that it's really challenging to like talk about societal stereotypes and how do we access masculinity, femininity, androgeneity, agenderness without talking about the societal sort of stereotypes that it is binary. So you can access femininity sometimes by doing something that is seen as feminine in our culture, or by doing something that isn't seen as masculine in our culture. Those are sort of two ways to do it. And so it's an interesting challenge to talk about this in a way that is gender affirming for all genders, especially those out of the binary, when we talk often about the stereotypes and the access to masculine versus feminine, which are sort of encoded in the binary. So the expectations are binary. Our tools to access those things look different depending on kind of how binary you are. Sorry, going in the weeds, but I just want to acknowledge that it's a challenge to do this work in a way that doesn't still reinforce binary gender stereotypes in some respects. But I think by acknowledging that that's not the only way gender is, it kind of changes the conversation a little. Okay, so let's let me see if the slides will help me focus a little bit. So the Gender Communication Lab. Trying to get to my perspective. Well, I'm just going to have to tell you, I don't really have the slide that I'm looking for. But my perspective is that the goals that I have for folks coming to the Gender Communication Lab are that they feel more connected with their gender communicative expression. So gender identity and gender expression are often talked about with gender diverse folks. The identity is who we are inside. Our expression is sort of how we put that out to the world. And sometimes there isn't a good match. There isn't an alignment there because of the way that the world is and our access to ways of expressing ourselves, especially with communication. And so my goal is that people just feel like that's closer in some respects. I make it very clear that my goal is not for anyone to change their communication or voice if they don't want to, as long as they feel like they are closer aligned in the end and they're more comfortable with the way that they are using their voice, even though it hasn't changed in the end, that is a win. So my goal is not to change anybody. My goal is to offer them tools and kind of control, I guess is the best way to talk about it, conscious control now of what you can access to kind of use different voice and communication tools. And I think that perspective is really important, because that's what I would say makes my clinic. This isn't about being arrogant, it's about having a perspective and strongly believing in it. It's what makes my clinic gender affirming, rather than just providing services to gender diverse people. That we don't have a set goal for them to change something. We have a set goal for them to, I guess, change their feelings, feel better about their voice coming out and their voice on the inside, or their communication in general. Which is why I don't see it as sort of a clinic population in the same sense. So I don't call it a clinic, and I don't call them clients. I call them participants in a gender communication lab. The idea sort of came to me as I'm going to be presenting lists of menu items of things that they can play around with and experiment with in a safe, supportive way. And so that's where the lab came in. They are the experimenters with their own sort of communication and voice, and we will help guide them, but they are making the decisions. They're choosing what to pick from the menu items once they practice them a little bit, and they're the ones who are participating in this this work. So I see them as participants, not clients, and I see it as sort of a lab, for lack of a better term, versus a clinic. I'm going to pause, and I know people had a lot of different other questions, but that's the gender communication lab kind of origins and ideas. Questions? All right, I see the chat. I also put a link to the GCL, the Gender Communication Lab public website for folks, for anyone to see, where I talk a little bit about it. It's not the best. I'm not a web designer, but it's something. So as clinicians, how do we navigate gender affirming voice and communication services without reinforcing gender binary stereotypes? Are there specific tools? Oh, this is going to lead into a different space. I've spoken with a couple of people. So there is something called the Trans Voice Initiative, TVI, and it's a group of trans and non-binary clinicians coming together to talk about this work. They're still kind of forming and doing their thing. I'm not yet a part of it, but I do think that the discussions around just using gender affirming as an adjective for all sort of trans health, non-binary health services should be really investigated. So what does gender affirming mean? To me, it means supporting someone's gender across the board and not pushing them in any direction, versus a clinician. I've heard stories, but a clinician, a private practice SLP in Portland, was working with a trans woman that I know, and the person that I know got to a place where they were like, I'm happy with this voice. This is what I want to sound like. This is great. And the clinician was, I think it can be more feminine. That's not gender affirming. We don't get to decide that for our clients. And so the hard part here is having someone figure out what is feminine or masculine or androgynous to them, and then figuring out how we can get them there, versus us saying, this is feminine, this is masculine, here's how you get there. Does that make sense? All right. Other questions, or which direction next? Y'all are welcome. I don't know. I think you're welcome to unmute and ask questions. I don't know if
I see
that's the
Elise
rules.
is raising her hand.
Elise.
Thanks,
there you
Elise.
are.
I have been thinking a lot recently about how to incorporate counseling into our clinical service delivery as SLPs, and where the line with our support in that sense starts and where it ends. And I'm wondering how do you support feelings of gender dysphoria throughout the treatment and therapeutic process?
That's a really good question. So for those of you who might not know, I know we're using some terms. Feel free to write the term that you hear with like a question mark, and I can pause and try to explain it if that's needed. And don't be, all I have is a scared. Don't be a scared to ask for more information about things. I don't like to assume, especially with things like this, that if you don't know what it is, this is the space to ask those questions. I guess that's the best way to say it. So gender dysphoria is I'll give my best definition. I don't experience it in the same way that some trans folks do. Um, I mean, everyone kind of experiences it differently to some extent, but it is the extreme discomfort um, between our gender identity and gender expression, or sort of about our gender identity. Or I don't know. Does anyone else have a better definition of gender dysphoria? It's uncomfortable, it's negative, it's depressing, and it sucks. Nicole, were you saying something?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to actually say that that sounds pretty good to me. Like, I think you said the discomfort between identity and expression is that's how I think of gender dysphoria also.
Okay.
It's just going to add the word of like there's a feeling of conflict, perhaps.
Yeah, it's an icky feeling. It can stop things, and certainly, I guess the best. Okay, so first and foremost, the process that I go through is we have an application online, and if someone's interested in the Gender Communication Lab, it sort of takes them to a sub version of the application where I get to ask my questions in a little bit more detail. And so once I sort of get people, or they just email me, and the next thing I like to do before they start is to talk to them. And I know that that actually causes some dysphoria for some folks. So whether it be Zoom or phone, but I try to explain, I kind of need to hear you in order to get a sense of where we want to go and what your goals are. And I try to find a way to make that space as safe as possible. I had lots of folks wanting to meet with me in person. That was more comfortable than on the phone, because a lot of folks, especially around voice, the phone is a horrible place for them. And so we'll have to see how that works getting back in person. But I would meet with them and we would talk about things from sort of vocal health care to their goals, to figure out if they're going to be successful at the GCL, because not everyone would. And one of the things that I make sure that they do is talk to me about their mental health support systems. I know it seems a little intrusive, but I have to say we're not those kinds of therapists, and we want to make sure that you're supported through your time, because this work can potentially bring up things, can cause dysphoria. So I talk to them about that very early on, to identify it, to sort of name it, and to make sure that they do have a support system. And most of them that I've talked to have counselors or regular friends or family that they're talking to. We do ask for a mental health emergency contact number, different from an emergency, like a health emergency contact number, in case there's a difference. Most of the time there isn't, but sometimes there is. And so I think just by being open to knowing that that will happen, we've had moments in clinic where someone was like, would a client would or a participant would just stop us and say, I'm feeling really dysphoric right now. And so what we usually do is say, okay, we're going to change the subject, or we're just going to, this is a good time to take a break or take a drink of water. And then what do you want to do? Do you want to keep going? Do you want to shift gears and do something else? Leave it completely up to them. And a lot of times they're like, I'll just keep moving forward. We just keep asking them to tell us how they're doing. But there is a fair amount of counseling that has to happen in this. Actually, with voice in general, there's a fair amount of counseling. And then this work, there's also a fair amount of counseling. And I think just being open to having frank discussions and checking in with with participants as we go through. And they've been pretty good and upfront about it. and they talk to me about how they talk about this work with their mental health counselors, and how there's this sort of connection, and it does things, it helps, and it sometimes hurts in terms of their path and their progress in mental health, but it plays a role. Ideally, and some universities do this, we would be pairing with social work, and they would be able to come to us and maybe have like this sort of mixed group session with grad student social work students, I said that twice, to learn about sort of counseling. But I can't pull that off at PSU very easily. I've tried a little bit, I can try again, but we've been doing okay so far, just with that acknowledgement and knowing that we have emergency contacts, and we have all of the participants have some sort of mental health support system. But one of the things that's really interesting, not just this voice work, but voice work in general, you can't, when you think about maybe how you say an S sound, or even like how you cough, maybe that's not a good example, how you say an S sound, or what vocabulary you use, or how sort of slangy you are, or how formal or informal your communication is. A lot of times those things seem almost manipulable, even though, an S is articulation or a TH is articulation, but we don't say, I don't think a lot of us think of how we say an S or a TH as us. But when we talk about our voice, like there is no separation between who we are and what our voice sounds like. They are kind of mapped onto each other. And if you listen to your voice and you don't like hearing your voice back outside of your own head, a lot of times people are like, that doesn't sound like me. Not that doesn't sound like my voice. That's like, it's like, that doesn't sound like me. And so there's, with any voice work, changing any of that is changing personality, changing our perceptions of ourselves. And so counseling is a very big part of all voice work, because it's sort of the sort of kind of closest mapped connection between ourselves and part of our speech and hearing and communication. One of the things that's really interesting within working with gender diverse folks, or just voice in general, as you go through different techniques for breathing and getting a supportive voice, a lot of people experience emotional reactions to that work. That's sort of, you can call it body work, you can call it voice work, but really taking deep diaphragmatic breaths, getting a supported voice, letting out your voice, and really being forward and resonant with it. I'm not doing great today on that, but that's okay. It really, I've seen people just start crying, and it's kind of like, are you okay? And they're like, yeah, I don't know why I'm crying. Like, I'm not upset. I'm just crying, because it's a release. There's this instant release when you find this kind of alignment of your breathing and your voice in a supported way, because we hold so much back in our voice. We hold our personalities in our voice. And if you're kind of like a shyer person, you probably don't have a very forward, resonant, projected voice, because you've held your voice back. And I've experienced that a lot. When I find a more forward voice, I feel like I sound super loud, like I could take over the room if I use that voice, and I don't want to. Like, my personality does not want me to do that. It's kind of horrifying, actually. So it's interesting to think about how our personalities, who we are, and what we do with our voice and our breath to kind of convey that. And we're asking people to release some of that. And so we're getting into kind of personality and identity with all voice. And then especially with gender and voice, we're accessing that even further. So yes, counseling is part of all of what we do. It's hard. It's really hard, because there are like classes that we can take to learn about counseling, but the biggest thing, which we're already going to be doing, is to listen. It's not necessarily our job to provide feedback if someone talks about being depressed, but we can validate the heck out of everyone. And that's something that we as communicators are really good at. Quite frankly, we're good at listening. We can sort of repeat back what someone says for validation and verification. We can refer folks to mental health counselors if it seems urgent, or make sure that they know that they should contact them. We have to be careful about our own scope of practice, but we can listen and we can validate. And we're kind of already doing that within our jobs. We're already listening to most of what we're working with. So it just feels like a kind of a bit of an extension of what we're already doing. There are some tools, though, you can learn for counseling, and they help your whole life. All I can say is they help your life. Okay. Where to next? I know we're when is this over, Tony?
Yeah, so we actually have reached the Q&A portion, but since it feels kind of like it's been this mixed modality, if we want to continue doing this like long form answers to your question in the chat, that works great as well. But if everybody would like to move over to just a Q&A, we can ask folks to popcorn those into the chat, or just raise their hand, or just speak up.
Excellent.
And I guess while people think about their questions and type them up in the chat, one that came to mind, I wondered what are some of the more impactful lessons that you've learned by like reframing your practice as a collaborative effort with the participants of the lab, and if there are moments that stand out to you or lessons that stand out to you from working with the participants, and an insight that they have given you that has changed the way that you teach this subject.
So what's been really hard? Yes, I'm trying to find something. I'm trying to find the goals. The one thing that I would say that's been kind of a challenge is there's so many things that we can work on. We can work on voice, resonance, pitch, intonation. This one I'm still figuring out where our scope of practice ends, but body language, gestures, and positioning, body positioning. We can work on language, so sentences, vocabulary, particular words, communication styles, whether you're more direct or indirect, whether you're, sometimes there's a division called rapport versus report talk, kind of what's your role in a communication conversation. And of course, there's lots of literature out there that says men do this, women do this, and I try to take all that out of it and just say, here are some menu options, but it often still comes across pretty binary. Even if I take masculine and feminine, man and woman, male and female out of the picture, it's not hard for people to see the stereotypes that are embedded within that. But I think it is important to understand as we grow up, we're socialized. And part of that socialization is how we communicate, what roles we're supposed to play based on binary gender stupidity, what roles we're supposed to play in certain conversations, which are sort of indicative of what roles we're supposed to play in society. You know, are you a helper? Are you the main topic person? And it's all kind of nauseating, to be honest, when you start looking at it like that. But the main thing that's really important is to understand the things that you were trained that you don't even know you're doing. So, for example, there are some folks who are wanting to increase feminine qualities in their communication, and they don't know that they've been trained to quote unquote mansplain. And I don't love using that term, but it's something that I think a lot of us can access pretty quickly in terms of what that means. And so how does that work? Is that something that we should change, or it's more just be aware of what is it you do? What do you want to do? What do you want to keep? What do you want to change? What do you want to improve? What do you want to modify? Like, but we have to find a way of acknowledging the tools that we're using now to figure out if those are the right tools for us. And all of those tools were socialized unconsciously, implicitly into us. And so there's this sort of awareness. it's like I'm teaching linguistics to folks, like understand what it is you're doing in your own communication style to figure out where you want to go from there. So sorry, I'm cursing a little bit. Treatments. Okay. I was reading Lily's question. One thing I would say is I quickly learned that I didn't exactly know what I was doing. My students didn't exactly know what they were doing because I didn't know what I was doing. And then the clients coming, the participants didn't know what they were doing. They didn't often know what they wanted. And as I have sort of promoted this away from kind of the traditional trans voice therapy for trans women, there are a lot of folks out there who have some discomfort with their communication style, voice, whatever it is, but they can't put their finger on it because they don't have the terminology or tools linguistically to even talk about it. They just know that something doesn't feel right between their gender expression communicatively and their gender identity. And so they kind of came to try to figure that out. And typically in a clinical situation, you do an assessment to figure out what a client's goals are. And unfortunately, there really isn't a clear assessment that you can do within an hour to teach someone all of the linguistic information they need to know to be able to even classify or use the terminology. I would like to work on my intonation, for example. People don't know what that means. And so you have to sort of describe it and teach them about what intonation is. And then they can decide, oh yeah, that's something I want to work on. So what I did was I sort of have this group component in addition to the individual component where I provide some seminar, like lecture, education about all the different aspects of speech and language that someone can look at and perhaps use as a tool to connect their gender identity to their gender communication expression. So there's a lot of, I think, education more than some other folks. But I quickly realized in order to do what we're going to have to do, we need some goals. We need some place to start for everyone because everyone is coming in with slightly different ideas about what they want to work on, but we can't spend 5 weeks out of 9 weeks figuring out what they want to work on and not really get anywhere. So I thought, are there ways to do this where we have goals that would work for anyone, any gender identity, anyone who comes to our clinic? And I came up with these. So like I said earlier, the primary one is increased comfort and satisfaction with their voice and communication. I also realized in order to really connect to these pieces, they need to increase their awareness of themselves and of other people's communication styles. Like if you want to, a lot of times we ask folks, if you want to change your voice, do you have some examples of sort of voices that you like? What is it you like about them? Can we incorporate that into your style? So awareness and comfort and satisfaction are the two big ones. And then, because I think this is true for anyone, I know there's some singers in here and some music background folks that agree. Participants need to demonstrate efficient breath support for voice. So I'll talk more about breathing in a second. And then also, can they produce a forward vocal resonance during speech? That is something that I think is worth teaching everyone. It's sort of, sometimes it's the equivalent of projecting your voice. And notice it says that they'll produce it. We just want them to show us that they've learned it and can do it. Whether they keep that or not, that's a different story. So we want to make sure that they learn how to do the things that they could do, they could keep, they could change, but you have to sort of practice learning how to do this. So these were the goals that I came up with. And we typically add another goal as we learn more about them and as they learn more about the possibilities. I can't get out of this. Okay. Now, Lily said, Lily, can you tell me a little bit more? I'm curious to learn a little bit about assessment treatments that are used in this setting.
I don't remember the exact wording from the numbered list that you provided at the beginning, but I was kind of trying to point at some of those, but also what you've been talking about for the last few minutes is very much related to my question.
Yeah, and so those are the goals that we have. The assessments are primarily the assessment is an interview with a bunch of different questions to try to help start that process of what is it that why did they come to us? What's driving them to come and do something at this moment in time, at this moment in their gender journey, to do something with their voice or communication. And so trying to figure that out, getting a little bit of background, functionally, what do they use their voice and communication for? We also have to kind of rule out to the best of our ability through a conversation about potential voice disorders. So we ask about vocal health, about smoking, caffeine. Do they use their voice for singing professionally? Do they ever experience tightness or tension or hoarseness? Trying to get a sense of if there's a potential voice disorder that we'd want to refer them to another SLP, because we can't diagnose that in our clinic. We don't have laryngeal. That word, can someone say it for me?
Is it a laryngoscope?
Yes, that's it. I was going to say laryngoscopy, but that's not a word. We don't have a laryngoscope. And so, yeah, we'd want to refer them just to make sure. Okay. Everything is going so quickly. One of the things I will say that I learned is that this work about gender and voice is not about gender and it's not about voice. And I know that sounds very strange, but when we make it about gender, that's when we're not gender affirming, because we're saying this is masculine, this is feminine. So it's for them, it's about gender. For us, it's about different techniques and accessing the variation in voice and communication in their particular language and culture to see what works for them, and not judging, oh, you want to do this, even though that's masculine and you want to do something feminine. Like from our perspective, if that makes you feel better, do that. Like that's why it's not about gender. Voice, it's not about voice, it's about breath. So much of our work is actually getting someone to breathe into their diaphragm and start there. Like once we can get someone to get a nice diaphragm breath and not breathing from their shoulders or not holding it in their chest and getting that air to exhale, then we know that we have the support for a good voice. If we have the support for a good voice, they can raise their pitch to some extent without harming themselves pretty okay, because then they don't, if they raise their pitch without a supported voice with their breath, they're going to hurt themselves. And so if we teach them to support their voice with their breath, they're not only going to feel better because they know how to access a better, more efficient breath, but they're going to be safer with their voice. So most of it is about breathing. We do a lot of lip trills and then practice ranges and try to increase their own range by going up and down and up and down. It's a lot of singing techniques to essentially increase their range, increase their coordination between their breath and their voice. And that's 70% of the work. Unless they don't want to deal with voice, then we go to other things. Intonation is also the second sort of largest thing. Sorry, I know we're out of time. Went by so fast.
You're right. It did go by so fast. Thank you for presenting and just having a frank conversation with us. And I want to thank everybody for coming. I really appreciate you joining us for our first presentation with NSSLHA, our first event. Thank you all for making it so great.
Thank you all. I mean, I don't know if anyone has last minute questions. I'm always happy to talk more about this individually, or maybe I can have a sequel in the winter or the spring or something. I don't know, Tony, are you sharing the slides and the link to the videos with students, or have we not talked about that yet?
Yeah, I'm putting together a kind of package with the resource document with the slides, and then with this recording. If there's anything else that you'd like me to include in that, please feel free to reach out and I will put that in there. And we're just going to put it out as for the listeners.
Okay. Yeah, and it should be the PowerPoint slides that I was talking about, and I think you can go to the media space link with the video lecture. I don't see any problem with you watching that, even though you might have to watch it again if you get into grad school. It's got a lot of detail. And then there's also a like a references list, a sort of shortened version of a references list that you can look at if you want to find more resources.
Excellent. Thank you again for sharing that. And yeah, you're right, Nicole, this is a lot of the things that we talk about aren't really covered in the undergrad. And it's so great to like expand that like 2-minute blurb in the intro class into like, a full 45 minutes. So thank you so much, Jeff, for doing this.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Bye. Do we just leave?
After a little dance party.
Oh, I see. Is it okay if I leave?